Hello, fellow seekers, friends, family. I hope everyone is doing great. This is, at this time right now, it's Saturday, November the 23rd, the time that I'm recording it now. But again, it could always go up tomorrow, the next day. But again, I always just like to give you all a little bit of a timeline. And so while I'm not going in complete exact order of the Sarah Boone trial, I did pretty much get through the state's witnesses. But I thought since the last video we focused on their rebuttal witness, we would look at the defense witnesses for Sarah, for her experts, for her defense. And so the first one we have here is Dr. Brannon, Dr. Michael Brannon. He's a forensic psychologist, and I'm going to just play some of what he has to say. It looks like, I kind of ran through it a little bit, and he is, what I'm thinking is he's their, I guess what they want to call their expert on battered spouse syndrome, although the defense will, it seems like they like to just say battered woman or battered women, which I get the psychology in that, but it should just be battered spouse, battered person. But, excuse me, Dr. Brannon doesn't really, it's not like he's, from what I can understand of this testimony, it's not like he's really read any of Sarah's records. He's just there to explain, I guess, what the symptoms of the battered spouse syndrome would be. And so, sorry about that. But, so I'm just going to go through some of it. I noticed that, gosh, some of these people, this is just in the long crime, the live feed during that time. Some of the people were so hateful. They're like, oh, he's a psychologist. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, yes, the psychologist, he has his doctorate, his master's, all this kind of stuff. But the one that the state had, yes, she was an MD. She prescribes medication, but never undermined a psychologist. And this is somebody who's speaking from just my personal experience. Most times anymore, the psychiatrist prescribes the medication and talks to you briefly. Now, that's not all, but that's how it was with me. And psychologists, they have done a lot of studies. I mean, in fact, one of my favorite ones is Dr. Berry. If you ever watch her online, Patrice Berry, she's wonderful. And there's Dr. G. I think he's like I think he might be, Dr. G Explains. He's amazing too. He explains the body language, and I think he's like a forensic psychologist so just because they don't prescribe medicine doesn't mean they don't know their stuff. So I just wanted to kind of defend a little the people who said, well, they're not, well, they are, trust me. But anyhow, so he's just explaining a little bit of it. So I thought, well, we'll play a little bit of them, although it doesn't, again, from what I could see, it doesn't really relate any to him reading, what specifically Sarah alleged occurred. So I think he's just up there to speak on as an expert on battered spouse syndrome. So after that long explanation there, if this is your first time here, I hope you find this a warm and welcoming place. It's obviously very laid back, but we have some great people here in this community. And I'm not a psychologist, psychiatrist, lawyer, paralegal, just somebody who likes true crime and loves to see justice for people who've suffered horrific pain and suffering from the individual. And in this case, whom I believe to be Sarah Boone. So justice for George. Okay, we'll listen a little bit here to Dr. Brannon.
Are you also required to update your educational background and knowledge as a forensic psychologist?
Yes, sir. So sure. So every 2 years, we're required to get 40 continuing education credits to maintain our license. And part of that is we have to, on a regular basis, update our work in domestic violence or battered women's syndrome. So we have to take those courses. We're all required, whether you're a forensic psychologist or not, to take that coursework. So as part of our requirements, we also have to take separate coursework in regards to domestic violence as a general term, or intimate partner violence. But along with that comes discussion as well with battered spouse, or what's oftentimes called battered person syndrome now.
And I apologize, I'm kind of bouncing around here, Doctor. I apologize again. For the uninitiated, just exactly what do you mean by forensic psychology?
So forensic psychology is a division of psychology. Most people don't think about that as often when they think about psychologists. But forensic psychologists are individuals who have degrees in psychology who are working to help to answer questions that come up in the legal system. It could be in criminal cases like we're here for today, answering various criminal questions, giving opinions about those questions. Or it could be in other settings like family settings, divorce proceedings, or sometimes civil settings like personal injury. Someone's claiming some emotional damage or something has happened to them. So forensic psychology is really the way that we use the science of psychology to help give opinions about various legal matters.
Now, what is the DSM or the DSM-5?
So the DSM it stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's kind of our code book, if you will, to help us to know what the different symptoms are for different mental health disorders, whether it's major depression or schizophrenia or anxiety. So it gives us a code book of here's the criteria you have to meet in order to have that diagnosis. And then we're able to utilize that in terms of either treatment, even insurance billing, but being able to inform patients too about what condition we think that they're suffering from. It's been updated many times over the years. It started just DSM, and now it's at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, text revised. So we've gone through a lot of revisions over the years to try to fine-tune in an empirical or scientific way what the elements are, if you will, of various mental health conditions.
Now, you've been asked to testify today in regards to battered women's syndrome. Is the battered women's syndrome identified or located within the DSM-5?
So it is not. It is not a diagnostic category in the DSM-5 or other coding books as well. There's others besides the DSM. That's just the most popular one. But it's not a formal diagnosis that it is contained within that book, a classification manual that I just told you about.
Within your field of forensic psychology, however, is there a subcategory that is located within the DSM-5 that experts would recognize as a DSM diagnosis?
Yes, sir.
And what is that, sir?
So that category would be in the trauma section of the DSM-5 TR. There's a whole category on trauma disorders, and it's most closely related to something that we call post-traumatic stress disorder. That isn't the only trauma disorder, but that's the one that what used to be called battered women's syndrome. Now I refer to it as battered person syndrome. But
Thank you.
All of it really is more connected to a trauma disorder like post-traumatic stress disorder.
Now, you testify on criminal matters. Do you also testify? You indicated also on personal injury cases and emotional. That would be civil, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In your experience, you've testified as an expert, as a forensic psychologist. You testified for, and today you're testifying for the defense, or were called by the defense. Do you also testify for the state of Florida or other states within this country?
Yes to both of those. I've testified in other states. I also testify for both the prosecution, the state or government, depending if it's federal or if it's a state case, and also for the defense. So I really get appointments and hired by both sides.
But how many times have you testified?
Well, at last count, it was about 1,500 times. It's over that, way over that now. That was from a few years ago. But I testify in a lot of different kinds of hearings and trials over the course of, mostly in Florida, but in other states as well.
Now, you're familiar with the fact that there is a special jury instruction that's been recognized by the Florida Supreme Court.
Approach.
So I went and skipped ahead a little bit because I didn't know how long they were going to be up there, but I just got it. They came back from their bench approaching or their sidebar, side salad, whatever you want to call it. But the judge did say the objection was sustained.
I apologize. Doctor, you testified as to battered women syndrome, battered person syndrome. Are there other synonyms or similar names for what you're describing, in particular battered spouse syndrome?
Well, we talk about it in terms of trauma disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, but the way when it's applied to the legal system, it's called battered wife, or that was the original terminology for it, battered wife syndrome or battered person syndrome. So it really depends on your setting. So in this setting, we oftentimes talk about this particular condition that I've been asked to talk about today, is really referred to as battered spouse.
I got to say, Judge Kranick, there will never be a sneeze that is not blessed. He is so good about blessing everyone's sneeze. I mean, what more can you say about him? Of course, many things actually, but I find that amusing.
Syndrome.
And have you been asked to give your opinion as a legal expert and on battered spouse syndrome?
Yes, sir.
How frequently have you been asked to do that?
I've been involved in about 100 cases of just that alone. I've been involved in some sort of testimony about 50 times.
And you indicated that you testified for the state, you testified for the defense, you testified in state cases, federal cases. Could you break down on a percentage basis the number of times you testified for the state versus testifying for the defense?
It's really close in terms of last time we looked at it, it was about 50-50. On most cases, like for instance, if there's a case that involves battered spouse, potentially battered spouse or battered wife syndrome, I'm usually called by the defense first because they raise the issue. If you're called by the prosecution, whether it be federal or state, what oftentimes happens is it's in response to a defense expert that's been called. So do I agree or disagree with that other expert? So I'm usually, the call usually comes first from the defense, but in terms of who I'm hired by, it's pretty even. It's about 50-50.
Now, this time Your Honor, I'll proffer the witness as an expert in the field of forensic psychology. Approach?
Yes, approach.
I wonder now, excuse me, that Sarah's back in her cell, if she is like missing the days of court.
Wait.
Ooh, you're sustained. Or as Daryl would say, substained. Excuse me. Yeah, but I wonder if she's like sitting in her cell missing the days of court.
Objection is still sustained. Mr. Beck, you may continue.
Okay.
Has battered spouse syndrome been accepted, to your knowledge, in the Florida court system?
Yes, sir.
Sustained.
Can you describe the classic system or systemology wherein an individual might necessarily suffer and then exhibit symptoms of battered women syndrome?
Yes. So battered spouse syndrome is a woman, usually a woman's response. Doesn't have to be, but that's a classic historical research went into how women respond in situations in which there's intimate partner violence when they've been the victim of violence. Now we know, of course, in other kinds of relationships, men can be a victim of it as well, or whether it's a heterosexual or homosexual relationship, that both men and women can be victims.
Thank you, Dr.
And
Brannon.
we still know the majority of those individuals that are diagnosed with that condition or given that condition, classified with that condition, are women.
Bless you.
We do know that it's a reaction, a strategy that's developed by the person who's being abused to someone who's abusing them in an intimate partner situation. And essentially what they're doing is they've made a determination that they can't effectively escape from the abuse. They can't just leave for some reason. They feel in danger or they've been threatened if they leave, that something bad will happen to them. So it's a cognitive or thinking strategy on the part of some coping skills or ways of protecting myself.
Sorry, I
and
cut a
protecting
little bit of
myself
that
or
off.
maybe even loved ones as well from some form of imminent violence or danger or lethality. Something bad will happen to me if I don't develop a way of handling this abuse, this constant abuse that's coming towards me. So the battered wife syndrome is really a way of thinking. It's a psychological change that happens with a victim in terms of the way they cope and strategize to stay safe for themselves and other loved ones as well, oftentimes.
I'm going to ask a really silly question, if I may, Doctor. I don't know if you've noticed a bruise across the bridge of my nose this morning.
I did see that when I came in. Yes, sir.
Okay. This weekend, hypothetically, if an individual was digging around in the garbage, the lid fell down and cut his nose, the bridge of his nose wide open, would you as a forensic psychologist anticipate, or a psychologist in general, anticipate that there might be a physical or a psychological reaction or response to that degree of trauma?
So I don't know if it would be trauma or not. It could be, depending on the
mean
degree
to
of the
the-
injury and the pain and things
the
like that.
garbage can?
But certainly you'd view that garbage can differently as you approached it. So it changes your psychology or the way that you look at that particular situation or that particular object.
So, would you be living in fear of the garbage can? Come on now. Come on, defense. Look, and I'm sorry, again, my opinion, but Sarah was not living in fear. I mean, all you have to do is look at her. She was not living in fear of anything.
So by viewing it differently, you may engage in different behaviors. You may approach it differently. You may have somebody else approach it. You may approach it with both hands up. So it changes
garbage
your
can?
behavior and your thinking about that garbage can.
Does that also apply to interpersonal relationships?
So it certainly can. No two people always react the same way to every situation. Trauma, one person's trauma is not a trauma to another person. But for people who do develop battered spouse syndrome, they do begin to change the way they view the person who's abusing them and what they have to do in order to maintain either their life or their safety, their physical safety in terms of their behavior and interactions with that person.
Now, is there a specific set of criteria that a psychologist, forensic psychologist, would necessarily rely upon in attempting to make a diagnosis or an assessment of battered women's syndrome?
Yes, sir.
And what are those criteria?
Well, you'd want to see one if some type of abuse has occurred. That abuse can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be emotional, or it can just be the threat of abuse or bad things that's going to happen to you. So there has to be something bad that's happened or that's threatened to be happening over a period of time. So abuse has to be present in order for this to be underway. Without abuse, there's no battered wife syndrome. But that's not enough. There also has to be what's called coercive control. Coercive control is really keeping the person's social interactions, overseen on a regular basis, controlling money, controlling preferences, even TV preferences, sometimes social media, looking at social media that the person is accessing or looking at, who they're talking to on Facebook, who they're texting. So it's a combination.
That kind of abuse is, to me, definitely describing Sarah to a T as the abuser and George as the victim. So yes, please go ahead. And I wonder if the prosecution will try to kind of turn it that way.
Of abuse and coercive control that results in a person feeling victimized, but that's still not enough. That person then has to feel like they can't escape from that. They've either been told, if you leave me, you're going to die, or a family member is going to be harmed, your children, your mother, whatever it might be. And as a result of that, they develop strategies to cope with that. Acquiescing, pleasing, doing anything they're asked to do, demeaning themselves, allowing themselves to be controlled. All of the things that would fend off, if you will, some abuse or attack or threat to them or someone who surrounds them. So those would be the components that you would need to have, and that dance continues to go on, usually repeatedly throughout the course of that relationship.
So I think what you're describing is, in a sense, a subjective nature to the syndrome that's being described.
It's both objective and subjective. So objective in terms of the facts, like what's really happening. A person's being abused, they're being told certain things, there's control over them. But then the subjective part is the person's interpretation of that, their perception of that. So there's really both going on, and they have to kind of work together in order for this syndrome to be formalized and properly diagnosed.
You indicated that there sometimes may be some defense mechanisms that are, or strategies that are devised by the battered individual, the abused individual.
Yes, sir.
In your experience and your training, do controlled substances, alcohol, drugs, frequently appear in your analysis or assessment?
Yes. And the way they appear is they can appear either from the abuser or the abused or both. What can happen from the abuser standpoint is they may only be abusive, or the abuse may become worse if they abuse substances. From the abused standpoint, it may be self-medication. It may be a way of coping with the anxiety that there's going to be something bad that potentially could happen to them or somebody else. It's kind of a way of dealing with walking on the eggshells. So if I use substances, that can deaden the pain, if you will, for me, or help me to forget about it. So it's oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes part of either the abuser's behavior or the abused behavior.
Do they, in your experience, do they, on occasion, actually defend the individual that is abusing them?
That's a very frequent part of this syndrome. Not always, but it's very frequent. It's why interviewing them becomes difficult sometimes, because they're used to explaining away their behavior, the abuser's behavior, my black eye, my missing tooth, his screaming and yelling in the background while I'm talking to mom on the phone. So they're used to...
See, I don't think that applies, because Sarah was calling the police on George all the time. Although oftentimes she didn't want to press charges, but probably that's because she was the abuser. As far as the screaming and yelling in the background, that again seems like that applies more to Sarah, because when, when George was on the phone, she was always interjecting herself in the background. The ultimate control.
To making excuses for. It's part of the coping strategy, trying to explain away this behavior. He's had a bad day. She's, really upset about something else that's going on. She's really never like this at any other time. So defending that person is oftentimes a part of the battered spouse syndrome, and getting the person who's been abused to get them to stop defending them so they can talk about the actual abuse becomes a challenge.
Now, the DSM makes reference on occasion to rule-outs, I assume for the diagnosis that's being applied. What is a rule-out?
A rule-out in our parlance says that we should consider these things before we look at other diagnoses. So, for instance, if we're going to consider schizophrenia, we should rule out substance abuse first, because oftentimes some drugs can create hallucinations and delusions and psychotic symptoms. So there's always rule-outs, just like there are for medical conditions. So look for this before you consider this, is really what a rule-out is.
Are there specific rule-outs for battered woman syndrome or PTSD?
Sure. So there's rule-outs for everything, because you're
spouse,
considering a number of different conditions before you make a differential diagnosis, or you pick that's the one that I think best fits this person. So yes, there's rule-outs for both of those.
For my sake, what is a differential diagnosis?
That's how you decide which one. Whether it's your medical doctor, your psychologist, whoever, it's how they pick the right diagnosis. So you're going through kind of a card catalog in your head, and you're saying, all right, there's symptoms of this, but that's also consistent with symptoms of that. So is it schizophrenia? Is it bipolar disorder? Now I have to ask more questions. It's a decision tree. And that decision tree helps you to inform the person and either make a diagnosis in a legal setting or help to treat them clinically.
Now, if the individual, the psychologist who's doing the evaluation, identifies the presence of certain rule-outs, what is their response professionally to those rule-outs in establishing or assessing the patient?
You have to go down a decision tree. And we all kind of do decision trees in our mind every day about what we should do or shouldn't do in certain situations. It happens automatically. It's more structured when you're doing it professionally. So if you have a concern about substances, then you would kind of take that track and you'd have to ask a lot of questions in that area. So you'd want to know what kind of substances, how often are they using those substances, what kind of effect have those substances had on them before. I just picked one of many possible rule-outs there. But every one of them you'd have to explore or ask additional questions because, of course, you don't want to come up with a wrong diagnosis. Because in a legal setting, that leads you to a bad opinion. In a clinical setting, it leads to bad treatment.
Now, I want to go back just a second. We talked about the subjective nature of the abused individual's understanding of what's happening. Does this subjective, or does the experience that they have suffered result in, on occasion, their experiencing or they're anticipating or assuming or imagining a threat that others may not?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
There she is, looking so cheerful again. Excuse me, guys. Yeah, happy days for being in court. Well, I guess she can enjoy the 2nd of December, but I'm thinking she may not enjoy that as much as these days, or the day they gave the verdict. Okay, I'm thinking we have an idea of what this guy says. Let's go and see what the prosecution says on their cross-examination. Okay, now we have Mr. J doing his cross-exam of Dr. Brannon, and hopefully, based on their, it seems like theirs goes a lot quicker. So maybe Mr. J will be quick on this one too.
Nice to see you in person.
Good to see you again.
So there's a subjective component to trauma, what I understand you're saying, correct?
Always. Yes, sir.
And so hypothetically, a couple could be in a 3.5-year relationship with physical violence, emotional violence, even sexual violence, but either or both of those partners may or may not believe that is a traumatic experience for him or herself, correct?
Yes, sir. People mistake the stimulus about what happens as the trauma. The trauma is really the reaction to it. So bad things that happen, people don't always react in the same way to them. So yes, sir, that's correct.
So for instance, a homicide detective or a homicide prosecutor may go out to a scene and see a freshly dead body, and their perception of that environmental stimulus may be very different from somebody who works at Dunkin' Donuts and just gives us muffins in the morning coming across a dead body. Is that fair?
Yes, sir. That homicide detective may be able to go eat lunch right after it, and the other person who works at the donut restaurant may not be able to eat for a couple of days as a result. So, yes, perception is a big part of how trauma occurs.
And I understand your answers today, and I'm not saying that they were different the other day, but I understand you to say that it's very important to do a comprehensive evaluation to get the full picture of what is going on in the perceived battered spouse mind, correct?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, at this point, before she was sentenced, of course, did Sarah think that she was going to win this, get a not guilty conviction. I suppose in her mind, that is what she was thinking.
The objection is overruled.
So, we've been talking about the importance of doing a comprehensive evaluation with as many collateral sources as one could possibly have when making an assessment about the battered spouse syndrome, correct?
Yes, sir. It's a relevant piece of information. Yes, sir.
And would you agree that obviously the person who is accused of committing a crime, there are credibility issues that you do need to care for when relying upon that person's history provided about the events leading to that and the past events describing the relationship with the intimate partner?
Yes, sir. In every forensic evaluation, that's the case.
Is this particularly important if there's a comorbidity with an alcohol abuse disorder?
Yes.
And can you tell the jury what alcohol abuse disorder means in the DSM-5 TR?
Sure. It's the biggest part of it is it's not just the use of alcohol, it's impairment that happens as a result. So it's the excessive use of alcohol, but that could mean something different, just like the excessive use of marijuana might mean. But it's the use of alcohol to the degree that it impairs or infects a person's life. And with that may come a lot of other things like deceitfulness or aggression or unreliability, sleep or somatic problems, difficulties. So, but the important thing to remember there is that it's the use of a substance that impairs or affects a person's life.
And if there is alcohol involved in the histories being given about either the event in question or any preceding events, must the evaluator take that into account when evaluating the memories and perceptions of the person giving them that history?
Yes, so in introducing that new topic about memory, we know that substances can interfere and impair memory. So as a result of that, you want to know what they were using, how close it was. If you're talking about a particular event, like a crime, you'd want to know if there was substance usage, and if so, what the person's memory functioning was, and does that match up with other sources of information about what those events were.
Are you familiar with the narcissistic personality disorder?
Yes, sir, of course.
Is that something recognized in the DSM-5 TR?
Yes, sir.
And can you tell us whether or not a person who is giving a history, whether it's the patient/client or whatnot, has traits, perhaps not a diagnosis, but even just traits of the narcissistic personality disorder? Is that something the evaluator should account for in evaluating the credibility of the history given?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because all forms of disorders or conditions or just traits may lead to inaccurate information, either not purposely or purposely. They may be deceptive. So certain personality disorders or traits can lead to deception or inappropriate or inaccurate information. That's why you need more than one source of information. Does what this person is saying to me check out with other sources of information?
And I don't mean to quiz you on it, but can you tell us some of the criteria for the narcissistic personality disorder?
I can, yes, sir. So it is a grandiose sense of self-worth. It's the consideration of yourself over anybody else. It's kind of operating your own world.
Sarah.
So it's an inflated sense of who you are.
Oh, yeah.
It's a misperception of how important you are to other people and your meaning.
I was a straight-A student. I'm an outstanding mother. I excel at everything I do. Yep, that's Sarah.
To other people. It's a sense of specialness. that you
Yep,
stand
Sarah.
out from other people in terms of special skill or skills.
Oh, yeah, that's
and
Sarah.
That other people, if they don't recognize that, they should recognize that. So the biggest heading there is an inflated sense of self-esteem and grandiosity.
Do you remember when she was being interviewed or interrogated by the two detectives over 2 hours? I don't think you know who I am. And I think it was then that followed her accolades to the detectives. So this is very ironic that their own the person that the defense is using is really as I thought, the prosecution is doing a good job in letting him share more what Sarah in fact is. Good job.
Are you familiar with an adjustment disorder diagnosis?
Yes, sir.
And is that in the DSM-5 TR?
Yes, sir. Correct.
Can you tell us about that?
Adjustment disorder is a person's reaction, and it could be emotional, it can be behavioral, or it can be both, to a situation that occurs. You broke up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, so you're upset about that. And so as a result, you're tearful, you're anxious or nervous or worried about what may happen to you as a result of breaking up with them, or you behaviorally may start not going to work, or get into more arguments or fights with your children as a result. So it's a temporary reaction to a stressful situation that occurs in some individuals.
And hypothetically, if a person who is giving a history for criteria of diagnosis, let me strike that. If somebody is giving a history and that is being used to come to an evaluation conclusion of battered spouse syndrome, if that person has been diagnosed with adjustment disorder predating the traumatic relationship, is that something the evaluator should take into account?
You'd want to know any prior diagnosis because it may not necessarily be exclusionary, but it could. So adjustment disorder is a temporary reaction. You're upset in a temporary period, and most of them just go away on their own. Whereas something else like a traumatic stress disorder is long-term. It's something that person's stuck with for a period of time that usually doesn't just go away on its own. So yes, you'd want to know that for that term I used before, that differential diagnosis. You'd want to know those things to compare and contrast them and hold them up against each other.
Now, hypothetically, if somebody says things like, I'm the best thing that has ever happened to you, and
Sounds like Sarah.
I'm the best you'll ever do, are those indications of the narcissistic personality disorder?
Well, they could be. You wouldn't want just that alone. You'd want to see if that was happening in other settings. Is that happening on the job, with friends, with family members? Is it showing up on psychological testing? But certainly that would be a red flag. You'd go, I want to pay more attention to that. I want to investigate that further.
And is it important when evaluating trauma-based disorders, because they're based on emotional reactions, to do that rule out on alcohol or drug use?
Certainly you'd want to do that. It's not usually disguised as a trauma-based disorder. Alcohol and trauma aren't usually rule-outs for each other, but it could exacerbate a condition. It could make you diagnose a trauma condition when it's just an adjustment disorder. I say just, I don't mean to minimize it, but it's not as serious as a trauma-based disorder.
Is it important to consider whether the abuser and or the abused behave differently in the absence of alcohol or drugs?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because you're trying to analyze a psychological condition. If, as a result of drug or alcohol abuse, their behavior changes or their perceptions change, that's not a psychological condition, that's a substance abuse disorder. So that's why you'd want to know that. So if their condition remains the same, maybe it's a little worse when they're using drugs or alcohol, but it's the same perception of threat or danger, then you're going to diagnose a trauma-based disorder. If not, then you're going to diagnose a substance abuse disorder. You can have both, but you'd want to rule one out as opposed to the other.
And are you familiar with the classic three-step cycle of battered spouse syndrome or domestic violence?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain that to the jury?
Sure. So there is a cycle of violence that was first developed by a woman in the 70s called Lenore Walker, Dr. Lenore Walker. She's a psychologist who's usually credited with developing the whole theory of battered spouse syndrome. And in the classic model, which we know oftentimes happens, not every time, but in the classic model, there's a period of tension buildup where things are happening, little arguments are happening, there's bickering back and forth, there may be some threats or some loud voices back and forth, but it's all things that are leading up to a possible violent episode. Then there's the episode that happens itself, the violent episode. It could be verbal, sexual, physical, but there's the violent incident that occurs. And then after that violent episode occurs, there's a honeymoon phase where the person who's done the abuse, they're apologizing, taking that person who's abused out to dinner, buying them things, saying nice things to them, complimenting them to sort of make up for the abuse. And it's it's called the cycle of violence. And the reason why is it tends to repeat itself in a lot of these situations with battered spouse syndrome, where you see this repeating itself over and over and over again. So people are kind of stuck in these revolving doors in their relationship.
And can one cycle be enough to traumatize a person?
Yes.
Does this trauma necessarily have to be coming from a man to a woman?
No.
And in fact, as times have changed, language has changed, and so when we keep referring to it as battered woman syndrome in the courtroom today, what we're actually talking about now is battered spouse syndrome or even intimate partner violence.
Yes, so I mean, inter-partner violence can happen outside legal settings, but it's really a kind of the large over-grouping, if you will, to be able to talk about all of these other things that can happen as a result, like trauma-based disorders and battered spouse syndrome. And you're right. The later research has kind of pulled us away from thinking this only happens to women in heterosexual relationships. We know now there's all sorts of derivations, and that men can suffer also from battered spouse syndrome, battered person syndrome, homosexual couples. So we know it goes around to everybody, but still, women are more often diagnosed with battered spouse syndrome than anybody else.
Does the trauma have to come in the form of physical violence?
No, sir.
Does it have to come in the form of sexual violence?
No, sir.
Can it come in the form of emotional or mental violence?
Yes, sir.
And would examples of that include such as running the partner down and telling them that they're no good and just general insulting and lowering their value?
It could. Remember, that's the stimulus, so it would depend on how the person who's receiving that responds to it as to whether or not it becomes traumatic. But yes, sir, that would be the first red flag you'd want to investigate.
And you mentioned isolation before. So if somebody in a hypothetical intimate partner setting is trying to isolate the partner from his or her family members or friends or coworkers, can that be, and I'm not saying necessarily, can that be indications of intimate partner violence that could lead to battered spouse syndrome?
So sure, that would be an example of coercive control. So if a person was doing that, that's consistent with that classification of battered person syndrome. Yes.
And hypothetically, controlling another person, the intimate partner's personal property or effects, such as a birth certificate or identification papers.
We're talking about Sarah again.
Emotional trauma towards the partner.
Sarah doing it towards George.
Lacking the control over those identification papers.
So that's a stimulus that could result, depending on how the person subjectively perceives it, in some trauma. So yes, all of the things that you mentioned could be stimulus, if
let's
you will,
see what her
that
expression
a person
looks
could
like
perceive
now.
as traumatic.
And hypothetically, if one partner A gives partner B a gift, such as a bicycle,
Ooh,
but
he
partner
went on and
A
said bike.
continues to maintain that the bicycle is his or hers because he or she bought it, even though it was a gift to B, can that be a form of emotional abuse towards B?
Sure, it sounds like control, but I guess you could interpret it as emotional abuse too. But it sounds more like a control mechanism that'd be consistent.
I'm not suggesting that it's legally or morally okay, but when one intimate partner does these hypothetical emotional things, non-physical violent things to partner B, if partner B has poor personal skills and coping skills and maybe consuming alcohol, is it unreasonable or unfathomable to hear that partner B responded with physical violence to partner?
Objection, assuming facts not in evidence.
Sustained.
You will approach.
Yes.
Oh boy. Okay, I think that's enough with Dr. Brannon. Although he was definitely more pleasant looking than Dr. Werner, but of course Dr. Werner wasn't there for all day under brutal exam. But that kind of gives us an idea of what we're looking at. So I'm going to stop here and see what's next. Okay, so the prosecution completed their cross-examination of Dr. Brannon, and now at this point, I'm just kind of trying to speed it up more so you don't have to hear all of the goings on unless there's some drama involved, of course. But at this point, Mr. Owens is saying that they had a witness that they were going to call up, and I guess it was a neighbor who witnessed, I guess the injuries Sarah sustained, but I guess they really don't think they need that witness after all, because, well, he had those big cardboard blown up photos of Sarah, and then I think they're going to call a person that's from the from the Orange County Police Department, who is going to, I think they're going to just show a little bit of according to what Mr. Owens is saying, George hitting the TV with a baseball bat, which won't take long, and then I think they had another witness for Sarah, another neighbor that is going to testify, and then their last expert, who won't be till later in the afternoon. So they're just trying to decide at this point what they're going to do. So we will come back in on that.
Minimus, or you may be saving her for rebuttal, I don't know. Mr. J or Mr. Cacciatore?
I'm sorry.
As it relates to Miss Uadan, CSI Tech, you're not calling her rebuttal?
I didn't get it during her trial testimony during our case in chief and the exhibit rebuttal.
Okay, awesome. So what we can do is we can proceed with Miss Uadan, and we could just take an early lunch and ask them to be back here maybe 12:50. So that way, if we have any issues, we can address them before we start at 1 o'clock. Ms. Boone, you were sworn this morning. I just got a couple of things to go over with you. There was a list of witnesses that was provided to the court last night and again this morning as potential witnesses that may be called in your defense. One of those witnesses was Maria Gallipoli. Your lawyers have advised that they may not be calling that person as a witness in this case. Do you understand that?
I do.
And again, similar to other conversations we've had, I don't want to go into any specifics of any conversations that you've had with any of your lawyers, just whether or not you've had them. Have you had conversations with your lawyers about calling Miss Gallipoli as a witness?
Yes.
Have you had conversations with your attorneys about why they are deciding not to call her as a witness?
Yes.
And similar to what we discussed yesterday, do you understand that your attorneys make the trial strategy decisions, including what witnesses to call or not to call?
Yes.
Okay. Are you still satisfied with their representation of you in this matter?
Yes.
And are you still on board with the strategy that has been employed in your defense?
Yes.
Are you in agreement with the strategy not to call Ms. Gallipoli as a witness in this case?
I am.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, ma'am.
All right, good on you, Judge Kranick. Ask her all of those questions so it can be on the record, so when she goes to appeal, they'll have all of that documented. Good on you, doctor. Not doctor. I keep wanting to call him doctor. Judge Kranick.
Then let's go ahead and bring our jury back in, and we can call Ms. Uadan and go from there. All right.
Can you excuse Ms. Gallipoli?
All right. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and stand and bring back in our panel.
Mr. Owens, how do you spell Gallipoli?
What I have.
Oh dear, Mr. Owens.
Gallipoli.
Mr. Owens is always struggling around to grab papers he didn't give to somebody or the other. Oh my goodness, Mr. Owens.
recognize our jury?
Yes, sir.
Defense, do you recognize our jury?
Yes.
I think you all could be seated. Members of the jury, once seated again, if you could confirm you complied with the court's instructions during our break by raising your hands. Our record reflect all hands have been raised. Defense, you may call your next witness.
Judge, we would call forensic phone extraction officer with the Orange County Sheriff's Department, Officer Uadan, to the stand.
Thank you. We'll bring her in.
Please swear or affirm that the testimony you give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. I do.
Good morning, ma'am. Could you state and spell your name for the record for us?
First name is Junella, Junella. Last name Uadan, Uad as in Delta, AN.
Counselor, you may inquire.
So, again, your official title,
Digital Forensics Examiner.
and are you referred to as a detective, or what is your...
Just an examiner.
Ma'am, Judge, can I approach the witness?
Yes, of course.
Ma'am, I'm going to show you what has been marked as identification defense exhibit 8A. And you recognize that video, or that CD of the video?
Yes.
Well, I think we kind of prepped you on it ahead of time. That was extracted from the Sarah Boone phone that you were asked to extract?
Yes, one of the media files, yes.
Okay, and is that video a fair and accurate depiction of one of the videos that was extracted from Sarah Boone's phone?
Yes.
And then identification Z, defense identification, same type question. You've had a chance to review that video, and is that one of the videos that was extracted from the Sarah Boone phone?
Yes.
Judge, this time I'd like to have these introduced in evidence.
Any objections?
No, Judge.
All right, what was pre-marked as AA will be received into evidence without objection as defendant 17. What was pre-marked as Z will be received into evidence without objection as defendants 18.
Judge, we're going to play exhibit 17 first.
You may proceed.
And is there a volume? Judge, do you have control of volume?
Volume is on.
You're gonna help me take this shit out. Real shit. You're gonna help me take it out. You're gonna help me take this shit out. As bad as I want to.
Judge, I'm asking you to publish exhibit 18.
You may proceed. Say again, sir.
You spoke about it earlier.
Yes, understood.
They're tender, no cross.
All right, thank you very much. This witness can't be released, correct?
Yes.
State.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. All right, can the parties approach momentarily, please?
All right. Well, he did say, what, you're going to help me take this out or whatever. Then, look, does this, okay, wait a minute, just look at her. He's going to talk and probably say it might be time for them to go to lunch, but she didn't look a bit traumatized by that. See, if she was a true sufferer and had that PTSD, all that kind of stuff, this would really be triggering her. But does she look triggered? No. Calm, cool, collected, jotting down her notes. No. Now, as far as the TV thing, it wasn't threatening her. I mean, hitting the TV, yeah. But I suspect, this is just my guess, I suspect the TV was already broken. And so he just decided, I'm going to smash it with a baseball bat. It was probably already broken. But that also makes me think back to when, I think it was the attorney, Mr. Beck, asking her, did you see any bloodstains on pillowcases or holes in the wall? See, he was, I guess, expecting it because he hit the TV screen or the TV with a baseball bat, that perhaps there would be holes in the wall, which there were not found. So I can see where that would look threatening, but it didn't sound like he was threatening her. And I believe that the TV was probably already broken. So there's that. That's just my opinion, though. Okay, let's see what else they're going to say.
Members of our jury, at this point in time, it's 11:08. I know it's a little bit early, but due to the pacing and how quickly we've been moving through the evidence this morning.
Thank God, right? Okay, so it looks like he's going to let them go to lunch, and then I'm just going to continue to follow along this little path here, since we're already on it. And we will continue on. Okay, I think I'm pretty much back to where we should be. Everyone's gone to lunch. They're back. The jury has been recognized by the attorneys. Sarah Bloom, or Sarah Brune, as Mr. Owens called her at one point. I'm sure Sarah has been recognized as wearing the same thing she was the last time they were there. So now I think the defense will be calling their next witness.
Members of the jury, again, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I see juror number fifth from the right to left, second row. His hand's already out. He knows what's coming. If you can, just raise those hands. Confirm you comply to the court's instructions. Record reflect all hands have been raised. All right, members of the jury, the defense is going to continue with their evidence and testimony presentation this afternoon. Thank you. Mr. Owens, you may call your next witness, sir.
Yeah, the defense calls Mr. Pearl Walker.
This must be a neighbor of Sarah's.
Thanks for the witness, Your Honor, just in case.
Ms. Walker, can you raise your right hand and face the wall, please? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you should give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ma'am, good afternoon. Can you state and spell your name for the record for us?
What did you say?
Can you state and spell your name for the record
Earl
for us?
Walker. Pearl Walker, Walker.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Mr. Beck, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Ms. Walker. Ms. Walker, do you know the defendant, Sarah Boone?
Yes.
Okay, how do you know her, ma'am? How do you know Ms. Boone? If you can't hear me, just ask me to repeat myself. And I'll
Okay.
do so.
Okay.
How do you know Ms. Boone?
She lived in the same apartment building that I lived in.
And can you tell us how long the two of you shared the same apartment complex, apartment buildings?
About 4 years.
And how is it that you became familiar with Ms. Boone?
My husband and I was sitting out on the porch, and we see her coming with her 2 dogs.
What happened then?
Then I would call her over with her dogs.
And what do you mean by call her over?
When I see her walking with a dog, and I see her and I look at her, and I said, "Hey, Sarah, how you doing?" And that's it.
And would she generally respond to you?
Yes.
And how, look, I won't go there. Would you spend time with Ms. Boone?
Did I spend time?
Would you spend time speaking with Ms. Boone?
Yes.
How long would you speak with her?
About 15 or 20 minutes. That's all.
And was your husband sometimes involved in those conversations as well?
He just say hi.
So you and Ms. Boone were the 2 primary communicators?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In the time that you knew Ms. Boone, did you witness anything about her person or her body that gave you cause for concern?
Sometimes I would see it like she had been choked around her neck or her arm be hurt. Have a mark on her arm. And I just asked her.
And would she describe how that happened?
She just say, I had a...
Hang on. The objection is sustained.
When you would ask her that, how did she appear to you to respond emotionally to your questions about her injuries?
She just say, one of them days or something.
Objection sustained.
Just for the record, instead of telling us what she would say, would she demonstrate any emotion on her face?
Well, I would see the emotion that she was upset about something.
And did you ask about her obvious upset persona? Her upset, the fact that she was upset? Would you ask her about that?
Yeah, well,
Okay, you have to just limit your answer to the question. Would you ask her about that issue? About why she was upset?
yeah.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I just can't go beyond that. Thank you. Now, how frequently would that occur?
I would say on the weekends when I see her.
Was that primarily when you saw her on the weekends?
Mostly I would see her walking through, going to her place, and I'm sitting on the porch and I see her then.
Now, strike that. While you were there in that apartment complex, and excuse me for getting ahead of myself, do you still live in that apartment complex?
No.
How long have you been gone from that apartment complex? If you don't know, that's fine.
Oh, it's been a while.
Thank you, ma'am. During the occasions that you had to interact with Ms. Boone, how did she treat you?
Objection.
She was a nice lady,
Overruled.
nice to me.
Did she ever act uppity?
Objection.
Uppity. Oh gosh.
Overruled.
Did she ever treat you in an uppity manner?
What you mean, sir?
Did she ever look down on you as a person?
Oh, no,
Did she ever treat you with disrespect?
no.
I'm going to object. This is character.
Sustained.
May I approach on this, Your Honor?
Yes.
Poor Miss Walker. What a nice lady to come out for Sarah. Probably Sarah's one friend. I hope they don't keep her up there too long. Just let her go home. My goodness. I wonder, it's okay to smile at a witness that is your witness and somebody new, but I just wonder what the jury, I know I've asked this multiple times as I record these, what they think about her reactions and emotions. I mean, if it's somebody she's truly genuine and happy to see, I could see why she would be smiling, but it's just all the other times she's smiling and the copious note-taking and the talking and, to the attorneys. But she's behaving a lot better than I thought she would be, but still, it's just, I think the worst part is that there is a lot of smiling and just she seems very comfortable there, which maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I would think the majority of us would not be comfortable in her shoes in that situation. But of course, which one of us would be in that situation? But you know what I'm trying to say, in some sort of court setting, and I don't know. It's just, if you watch others who have truly been abused, they are very quiet, and typically they are anyhow, withdrawn. I'm sorry, I just have to ask, how does Sarah live with herself? But I guess if you are, and I know they said she had narcissistic traits, but I believe, in my opinion, of course, only my opinion, I'm not a professional, of course, but she's a true narcissist, and she does not have emotion for anyone but herself. I think of all the interviews, she's swearing on her son's life, and just kind of, I felt like she'd use her son as a buffer or something, to maybe gain more sympathy from people, and I think of George's family.
Objection sustained.
And her ex-husband and her son. All the close people it's affected.
I'm sorry, I'm back, Mrs. Walker.
Oh my
At
gosh,
the
don't
time
treat her
that
like
you
I'm back.
and Ms. Boone lived together.
Poor
On
thing.
occasion, did you see law enforcement arrive at the apartment complex?
A couple of times.
And did you ever get involved in any of their investigation?
No, sir.
Were you ever approached by law enforcement and asked for information, evidence, insight into what might be going on?
No, sir.
Now, in all candor, were there occasions when you believed that Sarah Boone may have been under the influence of alcohol?
No, I can't say.
Did you also observe George Torres during the time that you lived there in the apartment complex?
I didn't see him very much. If we sitting on the porch, that's the only time I see him.
Did you know Mr. Torres very well?
No.
Was there an incident when you saw Ms. Boone with a black eye?
Yes.
Did you witness a pattern between Ms. Boone and Mr. Torres wherein you observed signs of abuse?
Objection. Nomination. Sustained.
You testified that you saw Ms. Boone on occasion with bruises, other injuries, and a black eye. Is that correct? Is that accurate?
Yeah.
And was there any pattern to what you observed in regards to those injuries and bruises that you observed on Ms. Boone?
One time I seen with a black eye and like she had been choked one time.
Okay. Did Ms. Boone complain to you about those marks?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Nothing further.
Any cross-examination?
Hi, Ms. Walker.
Oh,
Is it fair to say you're not sure when exactly you saw any of those injuries on her, correct?
say that again?
You're not exactly sure when you saw any of those injuries on her, correct?
Once she come past the apartment, I'll be sitting out there, 'cause we always sit out there.
Right, but we don't know if this is December or 2018 or anything
I
like that.
can't remember, sir.
Okay. And is it fair to say you have no idea how she got those marks? Is that fair?
Repeat that again?
Do you have any idea how she got those marks?
On the weekends, I see him and her go in.
Okay. But you don't know who, if anybody, put those marks on her, right?
Well,
Just calls for yes
I
or
can
no.
tell when they must have had an argument or something. I hear the dogs barking.
Okay, there's some proof.
And you're 5 doors down, right? Unit 8, Unit 3?
Yeah.
No other questions?
Any redirect examination?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Can this witness be released?
Yes, sir.
Let Ms. Walker
Thank you very
go.
much, ma'am.
She served her civic duty.
Ms. Walker, the deputies are going to come get you and take you out, okay?
You all done?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so
Aw.
much.
Look at her. See how she's just like, oh. Oh gosh, Sarah. Now, do y'all think Miss Walker helped Sarah or not so much?
Defense ready to call your next witness. Yes.
Miss Walker hadn't even seen Sarah for over 4 years. Maybe she kept in contact with her, wrote letters, called her collect. Oh, I hope not. I think the only person they should have left is that their big witness for Sarah, I believe, another psychologist. For whatever reason, her name escapes me, but I'll know it when they say it. Mr. J is like, okay, come on, Mr. Owens, TikTok.
Yes.
Oh, dear. Come on, just get your witness up there. They always have to go up there. Mr. Owens, quit stalling. We're ready to get this show on the road. Sorry, I'm crinkling papers. I got notes. I have notes everywhere, so I'm trying to figure out. My goodness gracious. Of course, again, this is all prior to when the defense brings in the rebuttal witness, Dr. Warner, in the marathon, the marathon testimony.
All right, members of the jury, witness is running a couple minutes late. I think they may be stuck in the security line downstairs. So we're just going to be in a short recess for them to join us this afternoon. Similar instruction that I've given you, please do not conduct any independent investigation or research regarding the person, places, things, or charge involved. And do not have any discussions amongst yourselves or anyone else, and we'll bring you back in as soon as that witness arrives. Thank you again for your patience.
All right.
Y'all can be seated. Thank you. We'll be off the record until Dr. Harper arrives.
Well, okay. I guess we will see what's next. Okay, they got their next witness. I just remembered her name is Dr. Harper. And I think I've got it to a place where I suppose Mr. Owens will call.
Dr. Julie Harper.
Yep, there we go. Yep. Oh, great. We're going to have to hear Mr. Owens.
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you should give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do.
Doctor, good afternoon. Could you state and spell your name for the record for us?
Dr. Julie Harper, Harper.
Thank you. Counselor, you may inquire.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think you've already stated your name, but just introduce yourself to the jury.
My name is Dr. Julie Harper, and I'm a licensed psychologist.
Would you tell the jury your educational background?
I have an undergraduate degree from Oberlin College in biopsychology. I have a master's degree from University of Denver. I went on from my master's degree to earn a psychological doctorate. That's called a PsyD. That was also from University of Denver. In completing that education, I specialized in psychological assessment, which means I had extra coursework in that area of learning to administer psychological tests to other people. I completed an APA-approved internship at Washington State University, which means that I was matched, and that was my site to practice being a psychologist for a full year, and that was between 1999 and 2000. And following that, I turned in my dissertation, which was in the passing of power in couples relationships. I then graduated and started my postdoc work in Pullman, Washington. As part of becoming a psychologist, you have to have over 1,500 to 2,000 hours of supervised work as a psychologist. The person that supervised me was a forensic psychologist. So during that postdoc time, that was my introduction to forensic work while I worked at a community mental health center.
Dr. Harper, how long have you been licensed?
I was first licensed in Washington State in 2002, so 22 years.
What type of position have you held as a psychologist?
Well, I was rehired at my internship site, so I worked at Washington State University College Counseling Center. I also worked 2 times at a community mental health center. The first time was in Pullman, Washington, and that was during the period of time where I was getting my postdoc hours completed, and then I stayed on after licensure. I also worked in Florida. When I came to Florida in 2005, I took a position in the Fort Walton Beach area at Bridgeway Center, which is the community mental health center. And while working there, I completed a variety of psychological assessments. I was directing the testing program. I also began working during the Department of Juvenile Justice contract work for evaluating adolescents that had gotten into legal trouble and needed an assessment for consideration of program placement. I worked in that community mental health setting doing clinical assessments and the DJJ contract and Social Security evaluations, and continued that until about 2010. In 2010, I opened my own private practice, which is Northwest Florida Psychological Services. And in the beginning of the practice, it was a combined clinical and forensic practice, meaning that I spent a majority of time doing psychological assessments to answer questions from physicians about things like ADHD, depression, to make treatment recommendations. I had the therapy patients, and I also did, again, Social Security disability evaluations, so numerous kinds of assessments. And then over time, I began doing more and more forensic work, including receiving appointments from judges to do competency to stand trial evaluations, sanity at the time of the offense evaluations for Circuit 1 in Florida. And I continued to do the Department of Juvenile Justice contract briefly, but then that it came up for bid and I discontinued that contract. What I did is I slowly reduced my clinical practice, because when you do forensic psychology, it means you have to travel. Your individuals that you're seeing are not usually out in the community. A lot of times you have to see them in jail. So it's hard to maintain a therapy practice, and I scaled that back over time. Eventually my practice became entirely forensic. And then in 2017, I took a job with the state of Georgia to be an evaluator full-time. I was working doing competency to stand trial and sanity at the time of the offense evaluations, and then assisting with risk assessments in the inpatient setting. I did that until 2021. At that time, my private practice was just quieted down, of course, from COVID, and I was not in full-time practice, so I wish to return to full-time practice with my own company, and I did that in May of 2021. And since then, obviously the courts are busy again. We're all recovering from the COVID era and back to full-time practice.
Now, where do you live?
I live in Okaloosa County, and that is in the Panhandle of Florida.
All right. And is that where your practice is currently?
Yes.
Is it fair to say you travel the state to? Is it fair to say you travel the state to do assessments or evaluations?
That's correct. I travel to a lot of cities throughout Florida, far south as like Miami, and then of course working along other
Is
cities.
it fair to say that you testify in?
You know what? He never lets. I don't like how he interrupts. He didn't even let his own witnesses. He's got to chill out and let her finish. Okay. I just had to have a moment there. Okay.
Various counties throughout the state.
Yes.
And I know that yesterday you were set to testify in Bay County, Panama City.
That's correct. I was testifying yesterday in a death penalty case in Bay County.
All right. And when you finished, you drove here?
Yes, I did.
My understanding is you got here after midnight.
Yes.
What other counties have you testified in?
Okay. What does this have to do with anything? Now, I understand getting her background, which I guess could be boring to some, but it is good to understand what her background is. I guess the common theme between these three so-called experts we've seen is that they're all in forensic. It does look like they do travel to testify. That would be tiring, but do we really care how many other counties? He asked, oh my God, it's just like, what does it matter? That's just me though.
Well, I've testified here in Orange County, in Miami-Dade, in Duval. It might be hard for me to list everywhere. Alachua, Escambia, Santa Rosa County, Walton County, Bay County, Washington.
So just so the jury understands, the nature of practice is you have to travel throughout the state.
Well, I do work in cases where the person is at risk of, succumbing to the death penalty, and so those cases require repeated evaluations in different vicinities, and so I have been, traveling to work on murder cases. There are psychologists, I suppose, that do forensic work that might just confine their work to one circuit or stay, but I actually broadly travel.
Okay. You said that your practice is now entirely forensic?
That's correct.
What you said? And you've testified about what kind of forensic work you do?
Yes, so as a forensic psychologist, sometimes I am tasked with testifying about something very specific. So for instance, a person's ability to stand trial if they're knowledgeable and can go forward with their trial process. I've testified about a person's sanity at the time of the offense, meaning if they had a mental health condition that met the statute as to not being sane at the time of the offense. I've testified in sentencing hearings. I've been an expert witness for Department of Children and Families. I've testified in vocational rehabilitation hearings as their expert, in what's called social investigation. That's what they used to call custody evaluations. So in numerous capacities.
And would it be fair to say that a lot of times you're appointed by the court to provide the service that you provide and you're paid by the state?
That's correct.
What percentage of your work is where you're paid by the government to do the work?
I would say that the majority of my work comes through with that court-appointed funding. Percentage-wise, probably about 90%.
Okay. And I realize you testify on occasion by the state, but majority of your time, 90%, 95% of the time, you testify on the behalf of the defense?
Yes, the evaluation's complete, and either side can call me for testimony, and the majority of the time I'm called by defense.
And so you make a living by traveling the state, and generally the court system, I think they call it JAC pays your fees?
So I make a living by performing work as a forensic psychologist, evaluating individuals, most of the time that are incarcerated in a prison or a jail setting, providing consultation to attorneys who might just have questions that would need a psychological expert to explain something to them. I also do fitness for duty evaluations for law enforcement, pre-employment evaluations for law enforcement and firefighters. So depending on the work that's needed, I do those.
Doctor, how is a forensic psychological evaluation different than a regular psychological evaluation? Can you tell the jury?
Sure. So if any of us went into a psychologist's office and had an evaluation done, it would be most likely for treatment. So things like if you qualify for surgery or you're going to have treatment, maybe you've got a condition that you want therapy for. A psychological assessment is very helpful in identifying a diagnosis and then setting a course for treatment. A forensic psychological evaluation has many of the same procedures, but the aim is really different. The aim would be to answer some kind of legal question that is posed. So as an expert, I might be in the position to provide some education or experiential descriptions of something that a person might be suffering from to people that are going to make a decision. So for instance, if it's a competency evaluation, I would educate the fact finder. In that case, it would be a judge about what is wrong with the person, or if they had any deficits at all, or if they were competent to proceed. In a situation like this, a forensic psychological evaluation might be geared more to identifying, again, if there is a mental health condition present in the defendant I'm evaluating, and then to provide a jury with education about what I found in my evaluation.
How many forensic psychological evaluations have you conducted? Estimate.
So just as an estimate, it's clearly more than 4,000. I've been doing forensic psychological evaluations as far back as 2007.
Have you been qualified as an expert to testify in forensic psychologist in court as a forensic psychologist?
I have.
And you said you've testified for the prosecution.
Yes.
And you've testified for the defense.
Yes.
Is there any difference in the work that you do depending on who hires you? Which side?
Absolutely not. A forensic psychological evaluation is an objective assessment of what's going on with the person. So you should be performing the same kinds of procedures in doing the evaluation. It should not matter who's retained you. What you're trying to do is answer a question.
Are there times when you actually do an evaluation and assess an individual, but then you're not actually called to testify?
Yes, many times that's the case. You will provide your feedback to the attorney, and then it's up to the attorney to decide if there's anything in there that would be useful to them, or if they're pursuing a certain kind of information for the court, they would choose to call you for testimony.
Dr. Harper, do you recognize Sarah Boone at the defense table with Tony Henderson?
I do.
When did you first get involved with Miss Boone?
It would have been in around June of 2020. It was the first I heard of her case.
And what were you asked to do?
A comprehensive psychological evaluation of Ms. Boone.
And did you do that in Miss Boone's case?
I did.
Okay. Were you given materials to review?
I was.
Is that standard operating procedure?
Yes.
You assess the client individually, one-on-one, and then there are collateral evidence or material that you also consider?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury about that?
Yes. So in forensic work, there are a variety of documents that are usually available in assessing a defendant. In this case, for criminal court, you would see things like witness statements. There might be body cam footage, or just more information about the offense itself. Sometimes there's an interrogation video. So you would get kind of the legal description of the offense and the things that have occurred. I also will often get educational records of a person, mental health records, hospital records, things of that nature that would describe their biopsychosocial history to me.
And you were given materials as it relates to Sarah Boone to review?
Yes, I have it.
How many times did you meet with Sarah Boone?
So 9 times.
All right.
Okay, well,
Can you tell the
had a
jury
little
what you
insight
did as
from her.
part of your evaluation of Sarah Boone?
9 times.
Well, we had a clinical forensic interview in which I reviewed her background history, so her early childhood. I also assessed her with assessments, meaning I administered 3 psychological tests to her. I reviewed her prior mental health records, her interrogation video, some prior information about her legal history. So she had been previously arrested. I reviewed that as well. We had an opportunity to review the transcript of her interrogation video. So there were a variety of things that would be considered what I did with her.
Okay. So you considered some medical records?
Yes.
And did you also consider some records from George Torres's records?
I did see his hospital records.
Now, do you consider, in doing an assessment and forming any opinions, an individual like Miss Boone's upbringing in terms of where they grew up and what their family environment was like?
Yes, that's part of gathering their background history, so biopsychosocial information.
And did you consider Miss Boone's upbringing in forming any opinions?
I did.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so of her history, I found it pertinent that she was raised with...
Conduit 704.
Approach.
Yep, this is a good time to shuffle through notes because there's that awkward silence where you're just waiting around.
The objection is sustained.
Would you have considered, as part of her family background, whether or not some of her family members had passed away early in her life?
Objection, leaving Conduit 704.
Sustained.
Oops.
Have you
Mr.
considered
Owens.
the entire family background and history without going into the details of what she said or what you learned from looking at records? I'm sorry?
Yes.
And did you consider her relationship with her mother as part of her psychological development?
Yes.
Now, do you believe that Sarah Boone does have some narcissistic traits?
I do.
She doesn't qualify or meet the criteria for that diagnosis, does she?
I did not diagnose her with that.
Can you elaborate on or explain how you feel that Sarah Boone does have some narcissistic traits?
Well, in meeting with her as part of the evaluation, the narcissistic traits that I identified would have to do with, as she described, being a straight A student. She reiterated about her abilities. And I
bet
felt
she did.
that was evidence that
Yep.
she had low self-esteem.
We've
and
all
her
heard it.
coping mechanism was to identify what made her stand out. And that would be consistent with a narcissistic trait.
Now, I know there's been reference in this case to a manual that all psychologists, all psychiatrists refer to. Do you have that manual with you?
I do.
And what is the name of that manual?
It is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the text revision. So it's the DSM-5 text revision.
Now, Dr. Brannon testified earlier today, and there was some evidence relating to when you suffer from narcissism, there's a sense of grandiosity. But is that from this manual in your studies and your experience, where they require excessive admiration and whatnot, that there's a reason for that?
If I'm understanding your question, there's a criterion in narcissistic personality disorder related to that.
What I'm getting to is many times
Yeah, get to it.
you may have these narcissistic traits, but really you suffer from very low self-esteem.
That's the underpinning of that criterion.
Would you explain that to me?
If I'm allowed to reference the DSM, then I can explain it best.
Just don't read from it. Just
All right.
You need to review. If you need to read a paragraph and then explain it to the jury.
So based on the description in the DSM, if a person's self-esteem is very fragile and they have low self-esteem, they may require more outside admiration or even appear more grandiose in their abilities, because at root they don't feel secure and confident. And so it's what we would call a defense. And so that criterion is actually a way that a person tries to make themselves feel better.
All right. Anything else you want to say about that issue?
Well, you asked me about why I didn't diagnose narcissistic personality disorder. And again, from the DSM,
Are there criteria?
there are criterion for each disorder.
And so when you're assessing someone, they have to meet all those criteria for you to form that opinion that they actually suffer from that disorder?
Well, the first, I guess, issue is, do they have the criterion that are listed? And then the second would be, is there a different mental health disorder that would better explain the criterion that you're seeing? The criterion within the DSM overlap considerably across disorders. And so there are some helpful guidelines within the DSM to remind you of that you may have what's called differential diagnosis. So if you're considering one thing, that you also are directed to look at other things. So that happened in this case, in this instance, that the DSM guided me to also look at other things.
But just for purposes, to make it clear, you did not diagnose her with narcissism, that disorder.
That's correct, because the DSM's description guided me that would not be an appropriate diagnosis.
Why did you not diagnose Ms. Boone with a
I
personality
thought she already
disorder?
went over this.
Well, first of all, it has to be a pervasive pattern of distorted relational abilities. So basically, if she is demonstrating in a variety of settings that she has these symptoms. And then secondarily, the
Objection. I disagree. I think she has more than just the trait. I think she is a narcissist. But that's just me.
diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is listed when you're considering personality disorders. The DSM guides you that if there are personality changes that are associated with the exposure to a trauma, then you should consider post-traumatic stress disorder and not a personality disorder.
Have you diagnosed her with anything, and we'll elaborate on that, but through your assessment, have you diagnosed her with anything?
Yes, so she has a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. she has symptoms of anxiety that would be consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is an anxiety disorder.
And you feel like she suffers from post-traumatic stress?
I do.
Now, at the time of this incident, this event, we're talking February 23rd of 2020, you were aware that she did not have much family support?
Yes.
Doctor, why do you administer psychological testing?
Psychological testing allows an objective measurement of what the person's symptoms may be as compared to sort of an average. So if we can see what the average range on a standardized measure would be for any person, if there is an interpretable difference, that gives me clinical information. So it's not just relying on what the person has told me. I've got an objective measurement that I can compare to other people. And then I also administer psychological testing in a forensic evaluation to help assist me in making sure that the person is intending to put in good effort with me. In some forensic settings, a person may have a reason to present symptoms, like if they're in a custody evaluation, for instance, they might have a reason to minimize symptoms, or they may exaggerate something else. And so assessments as to the person's response to you and if they're validly participating are important.
So there are tests to see if you're faking or malingering or that type of thing?
Right, and so you would call it feigning mental health symptoms when the person is either far exaggerating a symptom they do have, or if they're pretending to have a symptom that they do not actually have.
Okay. Now, as it relates to Sarah Boone, what type of psychological testing did you administer?
I administered the inventory of legal knowledge, and that is a test that has to do with whether or not she was validly participating regarding her understanding of the legal process. I also administered the Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test.
Now, explain to the jury what that Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test is.
So that is also a test of feigning to identify if she's validly participating in the evaluation. So if she had endorsed psychological symptoms or psychiatric symptoms that would be unusual or not typical of a valid psychiatric patient.
What were the results of Ms. Boone's test on the Miller Forensic?
She validly participated. There was no indication of any feigning or malingering.
As far as the inventory of legal knowledge case, what were the results?
Again, she was validly participating, and she did not even come close to the cutoff that would put her in the range of feigning.
Can you tell the jury what the purpose of the clinician-administered post-traumatic stress disorder scale is?
Yes. So that would be considered a very useful assessment of post-traumatic stress disorder. It allows me to interview a person about exposure to a traumatic incident and then identify if there's a change in behavior that has occurred as a result of that exposure to trauma.
At the time that you administered that test, did Ms. Boone in fact have post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well,
or tell me the results.
Yes, so the results would be consistent with a person having post-traumatic stress disorder. I do not diagnose from one test, that wouldn't be appropriate, but it is consistent with the background and the symptoms that I had previously, taken down during my evaluation of her. So the clinical portion, we go through symptoms, that was consistent with the outcome of that test.
And would this testing, all the testing, help you determine if Ms. Boone had a change in functioning from before the alleged trauma to after the alleged trauma?
And he blessed somebody again. I love it.
We'll talk about what the trauma was, but the trauma was the intimate partner violence?
That's correct.
Okay. But would that testing help to determine if she had a change in functioning from that trauma of the intimate partner violence?
Absolutely.
And did you determine that she did suffer from trauma as a result of intimate partner violence?
That was my conclusion. Yes, that's my opinion.
Now, in considering all the available information, you don't just rely on what Ms. Boone tells you to make your decisions.
No, I don't. I do interview a person as part of the clinical forensic interview, of course, but I also consider things that are reported, like in their arrest narrative, witness statements, all of the medical records. So there are a variety of sources of information. I'm collecting data points and reviewing those to arrive at a conclusion.
So you did review Ms. Boone's previous diagnoses in her history?
Yes.
Did you consider the previous diagnoses in arriving at your own?
I did, yes.
What did Ms. Boone, what had she been diagnosed with prior to you getting involved?
Objection, 704 conduct.
Approach.
The objection is sustained.
But you would agree, and I think this is a fair question, you would consider prior other experts who may have diagnosed her with something?
So I would definitely consider her mental health records, diagnoses previous clinicians may have arrived at the time when I diagnosed her myself.
Okay, given the assessment that you did with Sarah Boone, and considering the totality and the time you spent with her and the other records, did you diagnose Sarah Boone with anything?
Yes, so post-traumatic stress disorder. It's my opinion at the time of the offense she had depression and she had an alcohol use disorder.
All right. I know we've talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't know if I need to ask you anything further. I think the jury probably understands that. Is there anything else you wanted to add about that disorder?
I'm not sure what the jury's already been told about post-traumatic stress disorder, but in Sarah Boone's case specifically, because of enduring, she specifically noted the time that she was stabbed with the knife as being an extremely...
Sustained.
You have viewed... Have you viewed some exhibits involving her being stabbed?
I think that we have had exhibits in common. I'm not sure what was admitted.
Have you seen the physical scar from Sarah Boone being stabbed in the back of the leg?
Yes, I've seen her scar.
Right. You're saying?
Overruled.
Just generally, without getting specific, I think I've explained post-traumatic stress, but if there's something else the jury you believe the jury needs to know, but it's a sort of trauma that occurs as a result of one or more events.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is the psychological after effect of being exposed to a very significant stressor or cumulative stressors that make the person's behavior, thinking, and mood change. And so the change can include things like the person becomes hypervigilant, is easily startled, has trouble thinking, has trouble sleeping, so their body is in a state of agitation. It can also include changes in mood that would include irritability, difficulty relating to others, and that they might be resistant to trust easily. So those are all features.
They have trouble sleeping sometimes.
Yes.
Sleep deprivation is a real issue.
It's associated with things like nightmares and having trouble settling.
Now, you mentioned that you had diagnosed her with depression. Can you just give us a general understanding for the jury of depression?
So the persistent sad mood, including feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, having difficulty concentrating, sleep problems, changes in appetite, those would be typical of depression.
And Sarah Boone suffered from that?
Near the time of the offense, yes.
All right, can you explain to the jury alcohol use disorder? That's a fairly new name. That's 5 or 6 years ago. The manual came up with a different name.
It did, right. And so that would be, in layman's terms, you might call that alcoholism. It's a tendency to drink too much and then have some kind of consequence in your life as a result of your substance use.
And alcoholism can be depending on how much you drink and then how often you drink.
That's right.
All that is something that you would consider in diagnosing.
Yes.
The many people who suffer from alcohol use disorder, I don't know how to put this, are they in denial?
I would say that is one of the stages of alcohol use disorder and amenability to treatment. So in denial, it's because you do not want to acknowledge that there are consequences from your use, because in doing that, you might have to reduce how much you're using. So to deny means that you feel that you can continue your use without having to change that. So you want to maintain the access to the substance.
You don't have a problem.
That's right.
What is the difference between traits and a diagnosis?
Well, we all have personalities, and so you're going to have coping mechanisms that include personality styles. So, for instance, even though you might not be diagnosable as something, there are times when if you're upset, hurt, frustrated, you have a mood state that's unpleasant, you're going to deal with that by using some kind of coping mechanism. So traits of personality disorders might be present in the way that you deal with inner pain, things that you don't like, feelings. So some people, for instance, if they feel uncomfortable, they may cling too much or become excessively bonded to try to escape a feeling that they don't like, and that might be a dependent personality trait. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have a personality disorder, because that would have to be pervasive across all the environments. But when stressed or upset or not feeling good, you're going to use some kind of coping mechanism, and that might be one of the criterion, for instance, of the personality disorder. You would call that a trait.
And is it your understanding that this trauma that one suffers from repeat domestic violence can cause one to be considered suffering from the syndrome, we call it battered spouse or battered woman syndrome?
Yes, so the diagnosable condition would be PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. That's how a clinician would label the response to trauma. The pattern between partners, the person's coping mechanism because of that trauma, that would be what's considered battered spouse or battered partner syndrome.
And you're aware that concept of being traumatized by the battered spouse syndrome or the post-traumatic stress is relevant to a self-defense case.
Yes.
In criminal context.
Yes, I understand that.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, under the battered spouse syndrome, the person would experience a trauma or a situation in which they feared harm. And based on that fear of harm, they would react in a certain way that might not be understandable to other people. So their fear is based on the pattern of behavior between them and their partner. That might not be the case for another set of people.
Now, I know that Dr. Lenore Walker is the one who first uncovered this syndrome back in the 70s.
Her research study generated the term. She was interested in why battered women specifically at first, that was what was studied, didn't leave their partner because, of course, they're experiencing traumatic events, risks to their life, but then they didn't leave. So she undertook the original research study on that.
Just briefly touch on, because I know Dr. Brannon has this, there was a 3 stages that Dr. Walker developed for that syndrome.
I think you're referring to phases that a person may go through, or the cycle of the relationship. That includes the tension building phase, in which there is the first instance that tension is building within the partner. There might be a change in tone, a signaling that there's a difference in agitation. The second is the true battering event, so something has happened between the partners that's violent in nature. And then third, there's the honeymoon phase, which is to keep the relationship intact. The batterer would engage in what's called honeymoon behaviors, like trying to repair the relationship, apologize, essentially keep the victim from departing from the relationship. So those are 3 phases.
And is it fair to say that psychologically the abuser, does alcohol often involved in the abuse?
Yes.
And as far as the victim is getting abused, and you say it's a cycle, is the victim, when they go through that last stage, the honeymoon stage, are they thinking, okay, it's going to be better?
Yes, the hopefulness in that, trying to believe that the behavior has changed, that they're not going to be abused again, the hopefulness to maintain the relationship, to forgive. That's part of that last stage, phase 3, is maintaining the relationship.
I don't think I've asked this. Why would someone who has been exposed to intimate partner violence perceive the likelihood of a new violent event about to appear? Why would they perceive the likelihood of that violence differently than, say, a normal person?
Well, it speaks to the pattern. So any relationship will have its own special pattern, that you have things that only your partner knows about you, or certain looks that you give that mean something, and you learn that over time. So over a period of incidents, basically, the victim begins to perceive cues that would signal impending danger. Those cues could be really subtle, just a change in tone, or some small behavior that might not mean much to another person, but it has preceded other violent acts. So, for instance, if your husband decides that he is not going out that night, he might put on different clothes to stay home, and that could be a signal, like abuse and violence has occurred in his stay-at-home clothes, for instance. That might not mean much to another person because, again, it's specific to that dyad. Those 2 people know those patterns. So the victim may perceive a small or subtle change in their partner as a cue because they've become hyper-vigilant. The body knows when it's experienced a threat to itself, and it will take note. We record memories differently when we're at risk. So these subtle cues become very well memorized by somebody who's being victimized.
Now, on this, and Battered spouse syndrome is a subset of post-traumatic stress disorder, which you've diagnosed Sarah Boone with. When those personality changes occur and they persist after an individual has been exposed to this extreme stress, is that when the diagnosis occurs?
The changes would be as a result of the pattern. The person experiences a change, like in their sleeping, in their hypervigilance. That's when you can diagnose it. So you can have a trauma or an experience of a scary incident, but it doesn't mean that you will absolutely have post-traumatic stress disorder. You have to have those reactive symptoms that would suggest that it's present.
In your opinion, and I know you've gone over this event with Sarah Boone, this February 23rd, 2020 event, is your opinion that she was suffering from battered spouse syndrome at the time of that event?
Yes, she had the patterns ingrained in her behavior that would be typical of a victim who's responding to traumatic events in a predictable way. So that would fit that.
And it's fair to say that because of the intimate partner and the prior violence, that you would have a heightened sense of when danger was about to occur.
Yes.
When a threat was about to occur.
Yes.
A threat of danger.
That's right.
Now I want to talk about placating the abuser. A victim placating an abuser. Are there predictive cues which an abuser may exhibit to a victim that result in a high level of anxiety arousal, in which the battered woman may attempt to reduce through several different means to delay the beating? Can you explain that?
Yes. So the phase of the relationship that starts with that tension building, that is a jumping off point potentially. So if you can stop the escalation, you might stay in phase one for a period of time. Phase one being that tension building phase and trying to reduce it and not allow it to escalate. So placating the abuser might include distraction. It could include substance use. It could include a change of scenery. There are a lot of things that a partner will learn to do so that they don't have the escalation into an abusive event, if possible. It doesn't always stop it.
Now, in reviewing all of the data, all the reports, medical records, and whatever reports you considered, videotape that you may have watched, as it relates specifically to Sarah Boone, are her words her power?
Her words, I would say, are the weapon that she has.
Explain that to the jury.
In reviewing the available videos that I had to review, you would see that when Ms. Boone is very stressed, when she's experiencing a high level of anxiety, she becomes short in her tone. You can hear that in her voice. There's a strain, sharper words come out. I think that that is the way that she would try to respond to Mr. Torres. You can hear that sharpness in her voice when she's very stressed out.
Now, would you agree that victims may exhibit a range of behaviors when they're suffering from intimate partner violence?
Yes.
Self-isolation?
Yes.
Suicidal thoughts?
Yes.
Substance abuse?
Yes.
Why is he
And
filling
there
in the
are
blanks?
physical signs of injury such as bruising,
That's correct.
chronic fatigue,
Yes.
learned helplessness.
Yes.
Can you tell I know Dr. Brannon spoke on it.
Sorry about
Could
that.
you tell us a little bit about that?
So learned helplessness is when you start to form the opinion that nothing's going to make any difference. It comes originally from an animal study in which dogs were shocked, and the research study indicated that even when dogs were given an opportunity to escape the environment in which they were being shocked, if they were shocked enough, they just stopped. trying to escape. So
I hate to hear that dogs were used that way or any kind of animal. Ugh. Okay.
even though they had an opportunity to do so, they did not do that. That's called learned helplessness. It's the idea or belief that what your actions are going to do are not going to make a difference, so don't try.
What are intrusive memories?
Intrusive memories are an element of post-traumatic stress disorder in which you don't want to be thinking of a traumatic event, but it intrudes on something else you're trying to do. Like maybe you're folding socks or something like that, just doing something mindless, and that's what takes over your thought process. It's not something that you're trying to think about. We could plan what we're thinking about, or sometimes if you're just having this intrusive experience, that's not what you were intending to think about at all.
Is that one of the conditions that someone may suffer when they have this syndrome of battered spouse?
Yes.
I know there can be triggers that bring on these memories. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Are there also symptoms of this syndrome where, like in the alcoholism, where you have denial that you're in the middle of this cycle?
Well, as part of the relationship, there's an element of pleasure. Like you have early on in the relationship something that binds you together. So you're remembering that, you're hoping for that, even though the repeated cycle is going through the phases 1, 2, and 3, you keep hoping for elements of that honeymoon phase, wishing that it was better. So it is like denial. You're imagining the way it used to be. You have a recollection of that person showing you positive behaviors, and you're hoping for that. I also think it is typical for victims to not reveal to other people that the abuse is going on, and it seems like denial. In other words, your coworkers ask you, like, are you okay? Did something happen to you? You're not likely to disclose that. That looks a lot like denial. It is a denial in public of some of the private issues that you're having in your relationship, and that's because it's embarrassing. It's revealing a loss of control to other people. It's revealing that things aren't perfect. You might even get feedback that you should leave your partner, and that's unwanted because you're already having that, concern in your own mind about it. And so, it seems like denial on the outside to hide it.
Would you agree many people who suffer from this, they're minimizing what is happening to them?
Yes.
And they're numbing their emotions to it.
Well, to stay present and keep that relationship, it's very difficult for a lot of people because they're experiencing physical and emotional harm. So they want to numb it because numbing it means that you can keep that relatedness no matter how bad it's getting.
Do some people with this syndrome disassociate?
Relevance. Approach.
Well, I don't think she was trying to hide it. As many times as she called the police. Sarah loves attention from anyone, everyone. That's obvious. So I don't think she was trying to hide anything. Also, when George would make phone calls to the family, she had no problem in the background joining in.
Do you agree that battered women often develop the defense mechanism of being able to psychologically detach from their body during a traumatic experience?
Some people do experience that.
I'm just going to list some of the
Please, yes, do.
symptoms that you find in battered spouse women, and just to see if you agree with these. We talked about intrusive memories and flashbacks of the past traumatic events. You agree with that?
Yes.
The severe anxiety and hypervigilance.
Yes.
The panic attacks.
That is sometimes present. It depends on how the person experiences anxiety, but some do have panic attacks.
Very low self-esteem.
Yes.
Poor body image.
Sometimes.
Feeling that they have no control.
Yes.
Sexual dysfunction.
It can be, particularly if the trauma includes sexualized attacks.
Short-term memory problems and confusion.
Yes, that's part of PTSD sometimes.
And they can actually have physical health problems from the chronic stress and physical violence.
That's correct.
Fear.
Yes,
Constant fear.
that's correct.
Now, the abusive partner, the abuser, part of the abuse would be hitting, kicking, punching, choking, burning, and biting.
Approach.
She does not look a bit traumatized. I'm just saying. Not a bit. The only time I saw real anxiety is when she was like nervous, you know, when it first happened. But it was more like, oh, what are his parents going to say? But then the next day when she came in, she was asking about getting the crying that the wedding or engagement ring she had purchased for him off his cold, dead hand. I know that's one of the things that will always stick with me. I still want to know what happened to her dogs, Penny and Tess. Penny was the blind dog, Tess was the deaf dog. I wonder if Brian had to take them, or he had to take them to the shelter or something. I think they were older dogs. It makes me sad, because I wonder if maybe she was nice enough to them, but, you know, she talked about not feeding them or taking them out. Perhaps only it was at that time.
You may proceed, sir.
All right, I'm asking about common things that occur by the abusive partner towards the victim that create this intimate partner violence or create this syndrome in the woman. Hitting.
Yes, that could be an overt act.
Kicking.
Yes.
Punching.
Yes.
Choking.
Yes.
Burning.
Yes.
You be using weapons to hurt you.
Yes.
A knife.
Correct.
Curtain rod.
Yes.
Threatening to hurt you, your children, or your pets.
Yes.
Belittling and humiliating you.
That's correct.
Taking your car keys.
That would be considered a form of control, so yes.
Controlling your money.
Yes.
Control where you go and who you see.
Correct.
And who you can talk to.
That's right.
Force you to have sex when you don't want to.
Yes.
Stalking you.
Yes.
Slapping you.
Correct.
Do you agree victims that suffer from this abuse experience feelings of anger?
Yes, that can be in some of the phases.
Sadness?
Yes.
Hopelessness?
Yes.
Worthlessness?
Correct.
Intense feelings of fear?
Yes.
Abused abusers have a tendency to have low self-esteem themselves.
Overruled.
Abusers.
Overruled.
The abuser can have low self-esteem themselves.
Yes.
Have a desire for power and control.
Correct.
Have a tendency to use alcohol or drugs.
Yes.
Both of them, if you want to look at it that way. Sarah's really wanted the power. As far from my opinion.
Oftentimes have temper.
That's correct.
Become jealous easily.
Yes.
Very possessive.
Can be.
Yep, Sarah. Yep. Again, my opinion. I believe Sarah was jealous of George's family. I mean, unfortunately, she lost most of hers, but she still had Brian, who was still, God bless him, and Lucas. Oh, I hate to say her child's name. Of course, she says it, but that didn't mean I have to. But anyhow, but I think she was, and she prevented George from seeing his family. Seems like these are more Sarah symptoms than George symptoms. Just saying. You get the point, Mr. Owens. Let's move on.
The victims can suffer from severe psychological distress.
That's correct.
Is that what Sarah Boone suffered from?
Yes.
He makes so much noise when he flips through those pages.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Harper, I'm showing you Exhibit 14, this is 5 photographs. Did you watch the video of the TV, the Battered TV?
I did.
You considered that in your analysis and your diagnosis?
Yes, I did.
And I'm going to show you some pictures. Exhibit 12. I believe she's testified that this is where the curve line. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Exhibit 11. Are you familiar with this photograph over here?
Yes.
Exhibit 10, which is an arm. Are you familiar with that photograph?
Yes.
Exhibit 9, picture of the bloody knee.
Glad he didn't at least hold up the big poster boards.
Exhibit 8, picture of her black eye.
Yes, I've seen these.
Picture, exhibit 7, picture of her, Sarah's lips and eyebrow.
Yes.
And this is a composite exhibit 6, which is of the stab to her leg. Are you familiar with those?
Yes.
And I don't know if you've seen this exhibit 5 is where she spilled some as a result of his behavior.
I'm not sure if I've seen this photo, but I've seen the medical record associated with that.
Of that burn.
Yes.
Exhibit 4.
Yes.
Agree with that? Looks like exhibit 3. She was slapped on the tongue.
Yes.
2. You're bruising in the sport.
Yes.
Did you consider all those photographs informing your opinions that you've expressed here today as it relates to Sarah Bennett?
Yes, under the substantiation that she has indeed experienced past instances of intimate partner violence against her.
Is it fair to say that it takes time, a number of times, to visit with someone like this to build trust?
Yes, traumatized people are slow to disclose information. You have to build rapport. You have to make sure that they experience you discussing other things without an emotional reaction. They feel easily judged, as we mentioned, have defensive denial, things like that. So you need to build good rapport in doing an assessment with somebody that's experienced trauma.
So a lot of times they're very slow to open up and tell you about the abuse.
That is correct.
And they'll actually often lie about it.
Deny it, yes. Just say that that's not the issue or they're fine. So oftentimes I'll have an evaluation request come from an attorney who's having difficulty interacting with their client, and then ultimately it's a result of trauma.
Now, I know that you viewed everything, and I know you've seen her 9 times. Is there did you feel like you had enough time? Was 9 visits enough time for you to feel like you had enough time and information to form the opinions that you've expressed here today and given to the community?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have.
Okay. Any cross-examination?
Yes, sir.